Ever wonder why some people with autism pinch? Like, what's actually going on there? And more importantly, how can we best support them? Well, get ready, because today we're doing a deep dive into this. We're checking out this source, Cheap ABA Autism and Pinching, Understanding a Challenging Behavior.
Yeah, really important stuff.
It is, and they're all about making this kind of knowledge accessible, so that's cool.
Definitely.
One thing you'll find is that pinching, a lot of times, it isn't about like intentionally hurting someone. It's often more about sensory needs or emotions, how those are coming out.
Yeah,
It's like, imagine having this intense craving, but instead of for food, it's for some very specific sensory input. That's kind of what we're talking about.
that's a really good way to put it, actually. It's easy to kind of miss how important that sensory piece is to, why someone might do this. Because for some folks, that need for a certain type of sensory input, it can be really, really strong. Like the feeling of pitching. It's not like a preference.
Right.
It's more like they need it.
Right. It's on another level.
Yeah.
And Cheap ABA talks about how for some people, it can even be tied into like keeping themselves regulated emotionally. It's like that's how they create some calm or a sense of control, especially if they're dealing with anxiety or a lot of stress.
Exactly. Think of it as a coping mechanism. Might not be the most functional one,
Yeah, right.
but in that moment, it's doing something for them. And it makes you think, like, we really have to get that these behaviors, often they come from a need to communicate something,
Yeah.
especially when words are hard.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a distress signal, but without words, right? Like,
Hmm.
hey, something's not right here. And that's where getting why they're doing it is so important.
100%. Because then, instead of just reacting to the action itself, we can start to figure out what are they actually trying to say. And that lets us respond differently.
With more empathy.
Exactly.
Which helps us figure out, okay, so how do we support this person better? And Cheap ABA doesn't just tell us why, they actually give us some things to do about it, which is great.
Right.
And a lot of it comes down to being proactive.
Yes.
Because understanding why is essential, yeah, but then it's like, okay, so what do we do with that?
Right. How do we use it?
Exactly.
Well, I think a lot starts with thinking about the environment. Imagine you're being bombarded with sensory input. Bright lights, tons of noise, things are unpredictable.
Oh, yeah.
It would be enough to make anyone's anxiety go through the roof,
Yeah.
especially if you already have those sensory sensitivities. So like creating a sense of calm predictability, that's huge.
That's got to be so important. Like we're talking about almost creating a sensory sanctuary.
Totally, a place where they feel safe.
Mm.
And then we're not just reacting to the pinching, but it's more like, how do we teach?
Give them other ways to express what's going on.
Definitely. Like instead of pinching, maybe it's they learn to ask for a break or there's a sensory toy they can use.
So they still get what they need, but in a way that works for everyone.
Exactly. And they really emphasize in this article, like positive reinforcement is key here. Really celebrate when they use those replacements.
Yes. I love that. It's all about the positive vibes.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, you told me you were overwhelmed instead of pinching. That's amazing.
Yeah.
High five.
Yeah.
That positive reinforcement makes such a difference.
It really does. It builds a better relationship too.
Absolutely.
And don't underestimate giving them dedicated sensory outlets too. That can be huge.
Okay, so that's where it gets really interesting to me. Like, what does a sensory outlet actually look like in real life?
So it's all about those safe and controlled opportunities for sensory stimulation. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It could be a sensory corner, weighted blankets, noise-canceling headphones.
Oh, weighted blankets.
Right.
I don't even have sensory issues, and I love those. Okay, sensory corners, what else?
It could be certain toys that really give them that input they're looking for. Like maybe it's something with a lot of texture or something they can squeeze and fiddle with, or even just like scheduled sensory breaks throughout the day
Yeah.
where they can do an activity they find calming.
That's such a good point. It's like we build it into the day, then it doesn't have to build up into like an anxiety explosion.
Exactly. So all of that gives them those healthy ways to meet their sensory needs, which can often head off the urge to pinch in the first place.
I love that. So it's like we're not just reacting after it happens. We're saying, okay, how do we support you before it gets to that point?
Yes.
Let's create that environment, teach those new skills, give them those tools they need to regulate themselves.
It's about understanding, not just reacting. And I love that Cheap ABA brings it back to that human element. It's not just a behavior to manage. It's a person
Right.
who's trying to communicate something.
That is so important to remember. And I think it's easy to forget that sometimes, especially if we're feeling stressed ourselves. But at the end of the day, everybody, no matter how they do it, wants to be heard,
Absolutely.
wants to know that someone gets it.
Yeah. And it's so important to remember there's no one solution that works for everyone.
Oh, for sure.
What works for one person might not work for another at all.
Of course.
So observation is key.
Mm.
What are their triggers? What are their sensory preferences?
Mm.
And then work with them, and with the people who support them. It's a team effort.
It's like we can ditch all the guesswork and replace it with actually getting them and being proactive about supporting them.
Exactly. And, the really cool thing here is that this goes way beyond just the pinching itself.
Yeah.
It changes how we see behavior in general.
Oh, totally. It's like instead of that label of challenging behavior, we see a whole person just trying to figure out how to deal with their world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when we recognize what's really driving these behaviors, like the pinching, we can approach things with so much more empathy.
For sure.
And that helps us create environments that really support them.
It's about being on their team, not working against them, and finding what actually works for each person, because everybody's different. Which, makes me think about what you were saying before about how this whole sensory seeking thing and the emotions and how people cope, how that could be a factor in other behaviors too, not just pinching.
Absolutely. When we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it makes you wonder how many other behaviors that we tend to label as challenging could be reframed through that lens.
Yeah.
How much of it is about sensory processing or emotional regulation or how they communicate?
Wow, that's a really good point. It's like so many behaviors that we might not understand at first could actually be someone trying to tell us something or trying to manage all the input they're getting.
Exactly. It goes back to what we were saying before. Everyone wants to be heard and understood.
Right.
100%. But for folks with autism who might communicate differently, it can come out in ways that are harder to recognize right away.
Which is why this whole deep dive has been so helpful, honestly. It's like, even if we don't have all the answers figured out yet, just having this framework for understanding changes everything.
It really does. It makes us better supporters, more compassionate, more effective.
Absolutely. 100%. Big thanks to Cheap ABA for giving us so much to think about today. This has been so useful.
I agree. Understanding is always the first step, right?
Yeah.
That's how we create environments where everyone can truly thrive.
Couldn't have said it better. And for everyone listening, we hope this has given you some new ways to think about things and some practical stuff to try too.
We've just scratched the surface here.
For sure.
But remember, the more we know about autism, about neurodiversity, the better we can support people.
Absolutely.
Mm.
This has been an amazing look at pinching behavior in autism. But more importantly, it's opened up this much bigger conversation about really understanding and supporting neurodiversity.
It's a journey, for sure. And we're all in this together.
It's amazing, right? We started with this one specific behavior, pinching, but
It really broadened out, didn't it?
totally. We're talking about how we see all behaviors, especially those that we might not get right away.
Yeah, the ones that kind of challenge us to think differently. And that's where it gets really interesting, I think. Challenging our assumptions. And instead of just seeing the behavior, trying to tune into what that person's actually trying to say, even if they're not using words to do it.
Exactly. And it goes back to what you said before about how there's no one right way to approach this. What works for one person
Might not work for someone else at all.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it's not about like a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about truly seeing the individual and what they need.
Yes, 100%.
And that's what I think is so powerful about this Cheap ABA article. It's not just giving us the steps, like a how-to. It's really making us think differently.
It is. It's like a perspective shift.
Exactly.
Instead of going straight to judgment, we can choose understanding them and understanding ourselves in the process too. Because honestly,
We're learning here, right?
absolutely, none of us have all the answers. And the more we learn, the better we become at creating those spaces where everyone feels safe, understood, supported.
And isn't that what it's all about?
I think so.
Creating a world where everyone can be their best selves.
Exactly. And it starts with these conversations, with questioning what we think we know and with being curious about behavior, not judgmental.
I love that. Curiosity over judgment. So for everyone listening, next time you encounter a behavior, and maybe that seems confusing or challenging, remember this conversation.
Remember that there's always more to the story.
Think about what's behind it, the why.
Right. Think about their senses, their emotions, and how they communicate. Because it might be different, but it's still communication.
And most importantly, approach it all with empathy. That willingness to understand makes a bigger difference than you might think.
It really does. You can build such incredible connections when you meet people where they are.
That is beautifully said and a perfect note to end on. This has been such an eye-opening conversation, and we hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep embracing all the wonderful ways that people experience the world.